Dr. Goodall, thank you very much for accepting our invitation, and pass the mic to you. Oh yeah, so we decided today to do it in English. Usually we do it in French with simultaneous translation. The thing is, we don't have enough translators, so there's an invitation. If you feel like practicing this very valued skill here in Oroville, you can come to me. And Dr. Goodall is very fluent in French. You can ask your questions in French. You can ask him to slow down in German, in Tamil, in Sanskrit,
in English, of course.
in English, of course.
In English.
So don't hesitate if it needs to slow down, or if there's something that you don't understand. There'll be a question and answer after. There'll be an introduction.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much for the invitation. So, as explained, I will speak in English, but if you want to stop me at any point, ask questions, ask me to repeat for clarity, et vous pouvez poser la question en français, comme on vient de dire. Thank you for your kind invitation. So I have written out a complete lecture just in case I get lost, but I was not intending to read it, since that might be a bit boring. The theme is supposed to be illustrated by this picture, this series of pictures here. I was going to talk about spirituality. Is something I never normally talk about, I should say. I'm not quite sure what it is exactly. If one looks it up, of course, it's connected to the Latin word spiritus, and so which means breath, which makes it a little bit similar to the Sanskrit prana. Prana being the life force. And I think people tend to use it to refer to spirituality, to refer now to a belief in something beyond this material world, and an attempt to try to make contact in some way with that beyond. But of course, when we put together spirituality and religion in the same sentence, then it suggests this tension between, on the one hand, spiritual aspiration and then the constraining, but also potentially nurturing forces of organized religion. And so this image here is supposed to, on the left, this is from a collection of photographs by Père Faucheux. It's glass plate negatives from the early 20th century. I don't know anything about the figure, but you can see at once that he's a Shiva ascetic. And in the middle, this is the current head of the Shiva monastery of Tiruvavurduri. And there's a great portrait in the reception hall, which is this. And you can see him decked in Rudraksha beads and other jewelry. And this is a monastery in Malwa, that's to say central India, in Rajasthan. It's a place called Mehanal, at least that's the name of it today. It's the Mahanaleshwara temple, and beside it is a monastery. So with this slide, I wanted to just encapsulate somehow the tension between, on the one hand, the spiritual aspirations of individuals and then organized religion. In fact, this is something that I'm very interested in. You might see this logo at the bottom here, Dharma, with a bull. So I'm one of a number of scholars involved in a project to look at the evidence there is for institutionalized religion in India over the centuries. Because I think there's a tendency when we pick up books on classical Indian religions, typically we see them presented in terms of their beliefs, their doctrines, and there is very little about the institutions which made this possible, which allowed this development. And I think with Buddhism, of course, because it is fundamentally and from the beginnings a congregational religion with monks and monasteries, this is less the case. But certainly with the currents of Shaiva religion and Hindu currents of religion, we tend not to look at monasteries and big foundations and the big institutions which as part of the history. And so this project Dharma is about trying to look through inscriptions and looking at buildings and so forth and understanding the institutional framework which enabled the intellectual developments which we associate with these different traditions. So there are, of course, all kinds of ascetics in India, but I think for many of us, there are Vaishnavas and there are all kinds of different schools, but I think for most of us, when we think of asceticism and people pursuing a spiritual path by abandoning religion, society, we think of Shaivas. I mean, our image is very much of these figures with Rudraksha beads, no clothes, their hair matted, and so forth. And this is, of course, old, and we see images. On the left here, we see an image of Shiva. As you know, this is Dakshinamurti, Shiva teaching towards the south. And there he is with a yoga patta, this band around his legs to enable him to sit comfortably, to meditate, and various other accoutrements of the forest, the animals around him, and the tree behind him. He's sitting under a banyan, and his hair is hanging in jata bhara, that is to say, matted locks hanging in a mass. This association is old and very widespread. So just to show you a couple of instances, this is from the bas-relief sculptures in Angkor Wat. You know, there's nearly a kilometre or more than a kilometre maybe around the temple bas-relief sculptures, all kinds of fascinating things shown. And there's one procession of Shaiva ascetics. This is from Indonesia, now I believe its status is uncertain. This large collection of Singgasari images, which used to be in Leiden, but was transported back repatriated to Indonesia. But I believe there's been a fire, as you might have heard, in the museum in Jakarta. And I think this collection of sculptures, I'm not sure what its fate is in this fire. In any case, you see again a trident, one of the emblems of Shiva. You see the Rudraksha beads that he's holding. This is the sage Agastya, but very much conceived of as a Shaiva ascetic. Yes, and more, this is from Champa in South Vietnam. I think this image we see absolutely everywhere of this huge area. So just I'm going to be trying to draw also on evidence from this wider area. Another thing that we find across this wide area is the presence of caves which have been dedicated to Shaiva asceticism. In other words, caves produced for people to sit in and meditate. You see, I've chosen this old map because it has this nice terminology in Latin. You see India intraganjem, India within the Ganges, and then for Southeast Asia, India extraganjem, India outside the Ganges, this corresponding to this old conception that somehow there is a sort of cultural unity for this much wider area. And I wanted to just show you one or two things from Cambodia and Laos. So this is the Cambodian territory, or the Khmer-speaking territory. This is from an old map of Luné de la Jonquière. Angkor is circled there. Then below it is the great lake of the Tonle Sap. And coming down from the north is the Mekong. And I wanted just to show you something from Wat Phu. So this is an area where most of the history from between, say, the 5th century and the 14th depends on this body of inscriptions, about 1,500 stone inscriptions in Sanskrit, Old Khmer, or both, which survive from the 6th through the 14th centuries. So up here in the north, Wat Phu, this is a dramatic site. It was the most sacred Shaiva temple in that area. Many, many references to it from the inscriptions from the entire territory. He was known as Shiva Bhadreshwara. The Shaiva temple is somewhere like here, halfway up the mountain, and the mountain is supposed to have a peak which we cannot see here, which resembled a linga. So it's known as Linga Parvata in many of the old documents. And here, just by way of example, a little way above the main Shaiva temple, we have this cave. So this is a series of shots that are getting closer and closer, and this inscription here is on the sloping upper part. And the inscription is in Sanskrit, and it explains how the cave came to be, that's to say how it was sort of arranged. by the way, please do stop me if you are not understanding anything. And even if you are understanding and have questions, it's sometimes useful for me to have feedback, then I know where you are, whether you are thinking along the same lines, whether you are following. So do not hesitate.
Can I ask something?
Please do.
I've heard always about Shiva, and you say Shiva. What is there a difference? Or?
Okay, so Shiva and Shaiva. Sorry, Shiva is the name of the god. Shaiva, it means literally that which is taught by Shiva. So Shaivam Shastram is the body of doctrine taught by Shiva. And so by extension we refer to Shaivas, that's say people who follow the teachings of Shiva. Very important to have this kind of basic thing sorted out at the beginning. So please, if there are any other points like this, please do raise your voice. So this inscription, so here's an estampage of it. Estampage is the term that I now use. In English, I think it's called a squeeze, which sounds a little bit irreverent or silly, but it's not a rubbing. It's when you place paper, wet paper, onto the object, bash it in with a brush, and then you can lightly ink it, as here, so that you get an impression. This inscription, Samadhe Sarvatapodhananam Iyam Guha Vaktrugahetiranna Sa Nirmita Vaktrashivena Shaktya Vibhati Bhadreshwar Shaila Parshve. So it's a metrical. Practically all the inscriptions of this part of the world are in, the Sanskrit is in meter. And it explains that this cave called Vaktra Guha, fashioned by Vaktra Shiva, is established for meditation for all ascetics. So this follows a common pattern. We find these places where there are inscriptions, and sometimes it's explicitly said, somebody came here, they meditated, they died, and then, but the cave was then arranged, and it is then to be used henceforth for individual spiritual pursuits, for meditation and living in. This is a very widespread phenomenon. We find this all over the territory.
What's the script?
Okay, so people often ask me what the script is, and there is no good answer to this kind of thing. There are few names for ancient names for scripts. This is the Angkorian derivation from the original South Indian script, which people often call South Indian Brahmi. But this is a form which is a little bit cursive, with the so-called head marks missing. So I mean, we do not. So the answer to that is there seem to be very few documents which actually say this is such a script. This script bears this or that name. We have, of course, many script names which are not assigned, but I would call this Grantha or something. It's sort of like Pallava Grantha. It's derived from Pallava Grantha. So it's, if we look at documents from the 6th, 7th, and early 8th centuries across the whole of Southeast Asia, they're the same script as what we find along the whole of the eastern littoral of India. So Pallavas, and in Southeast Asia people often say this is Pallava Grantha. So in other words, if you can read any document from 6th century South India, you can read any document from 6th century Champa in South Vietnam, or Indonesia, or Cambodia, or Thailand. It's the same script, and it develops differently. It starts really to branch apart in the 9th century. So by the time you reach the 9th century, the scripts are so different that you actually really need to spend a little bit of time learning the derivatives. So historians of the Roman world, there's a famous lady called Mary Beard, for example, who's very prominent in British media. They often lament that you have to wait centuries before you get any information about what it is that Romans believed, what was Roman religion, how was it conceived. And so this is very odd to me, because in the Indian world we have, of course, from the very earliest times, enormous amounts of information about how people thought about religious questions. Whereas, so it's as though Indian thinkers spurning everything that they regarded as ephemeral every day, they didn't record such things. All the kinds of things that we know about the early Roman world, the classical world in Europe, lots and lots of grave memorials, and we know many things about everyday life. But the Indian authors seem to have spurned that and focused instead on these big essential questions like what is language and what are its rules, or what is the soul and what is the divine and what is the relationship between the two, and can we reach a liberated state and how would that liberated state be qualified, and so forth. In other words, we have an enormous literature on religion and almost nothing on ephemera. So it's one of these big differences, I think, between these worlds. So for Shaivism, things start a bit later. So this is not one of the earliest of the Upanishads, at least this is how it's usually thought of, the Shvetashvatara Upanishad. But it's an Upanishad which clearly has a very Shaiva flavour all the way through. And you can see that it starts with these big questions. Is Brahman the cause? Whence are we born? By what do we live? Where do we dwell at the end? Please tell us, O ye who know Brahman, under whose guidance we abide, whether in pleasure or in pain. It goes without saying that one can translate many of these words slightly differently and have a different impression. I mean, one of the things that's uncertain is whether this is really evocative, O ye who know Brahman, or is it really we who know Brahman, we are asking these questions. Anyway, these big questions are invoked at the beginning of the text, and then what we find in a subsequent chapter of this same Upanishad is an account of yoga, or a sort of proto-yoga. So the answer to these questions is somehow it is the universal soul, and it is Shiva identified with the universal soul, who is the cause, who is the point to which we return, who is all of these things. And how do you get there? And the answer seems to be some sort of yoga. So meditation in comfortable postures, and as I said, a sort of proto-yoga is described in a subsequent chapter. And at the very end of the work, we have this statement about the context in which the text was taught. Through the power of austerity and through the grace of the Lord, the sage Shvetashvatara realized Brahman and proclaimed the highly sacred knowledge supremely cherished by the company of seers to sannyasins of the most advanced stage. So I put that in italics because it translates this expression atyashamibhya. I put it in italics there in the transcription. Atyashamibhya. Traditional scholarship, early commentaries and so forth, translate this expression in this sort of way. They take it to mean ati ashrama. So ashrama is an ashrama, of course, but it's also one of the four walks of life. You might have heard of this idea that we all go through life, and some people say that these are it's a sequence. You start as the celibate student, the brahmacharin, then you become a householder, a grihastha, and then a forest dweller is an option, or an ascetic. And so what they take this word ati ashrami to mean is one who belongs to ashrama, and then we have a possessive suffix, ashramin, and then ati ashramin means one who belongs to this area beyond ati, beyond the ashramas. So this is one way of understanding it. But I think that what we know of the earliest group of Parshvatas is that they use this affix, this prefix ati on many words. They talk about following an ati marga, that's to say a path which is beyond. And they talk about following an ati yoga, a yoga which is beyond other people's yoga. And there is some evidence also that this term atyashramin refers in fact to Parshvatas. So I don't know, have you ever heard of the term Parshvata before? I'm not quite sure. So the Parshvatas are an extreme group of ascetics who are Shaiva, and they typically wander, they have a program in which they meditate on Shiva, they focus on certain mantras of Shiva, which they repeat, and they live a life of extreme asceticism, culminating in a period in which they live in the cremation ground, smeared in ashes, with a skull bowl, and eating and living off whatever they can find in the cremation ground. So this religion, something like that, indeed. And we have some texts which belong to the religion. They seem to be very early, and they describe this life of extreme asceticism. And in a way, what they're doing is they're imitating Shiva, who, according to myth, after this is the expiation for killing a Brahmin, for Brahminicide, that you must wander with a bell declaring your presence, naked, with the skull, a human skull, as a begging bowl, smeared in ash, and with various other accoutrements of the cremation ground for, I forget now how many years. But this is something which is then applied to Shiva, because there's a moment which he cuts off one of the heads of Brahma, and this is regarded as an act of Brahminicide. And so in a way this is what people sometimes call imitatio Dei, that's the imitation of God. God imitates the ascetics imitate God, rather like we saw with Dakshinamurti, who appears like a Shaiva ascetic. Similarly, yes.
Can you explain why they want to behead Brahma?
Sorry, that is a long story, and all these Indian myths are rather complicated, boxed together. Why does he take off Brahma's head? I'm afraid I don't remember any particular version at the moment of the story. There are various versions. In any case, there is an episode in which Shiva cuts off one of Brahma's heads. Brahma is supposed to have 4 heads, and one of the inconsistencies of this particular myth is that there never seems to be a moment when he has 5. He always has 4, both before and after the decapitation. Anyway, there is some kind of quarrel, and he cuts off it. He removes it with a nail, with one of his fingernails, and then in expiation must wander around as an ascetic. And this is often represented on South Indian temples, partly because it's also part of the Devadaru myth. But I think if I start to recount that myth, we'll go too far, so I won't recount it. But you see the skull as a begging bowl. You see that he is naked. Here he's clad with a snake. He has his hair matted. The staff, this is rather rarely represented, but I think there is a skull at the top of the staff. So this is an object called a katwanga. It's more commonly represented in eastern India and other areas, not in the south. But all of these emblems of the cremation ground and the little drum declaring where he's going, the little damaru kind of drum. So these extreme Parshvatas yes, well, I think that in the Shvetashvatara Upanishad it's very likely that Apyashamin refers to this group of Parshvatas, and the dating of the Shvetashvatara Upanishad, which I showed you at the beginning, and the dating of the various texts that teach the Parshvata religion is a very tricky thing. One of the things that we find in this literature is it speaks only of mystical ideas, of the pursuit of the spiritual, and there is almost no contextualization. So, and one of the things that one can ask oneself, one of the things that is puzzling, is how could such a religion propagate itself? How will it continue from one generation to the next? These extreme ascetics who live and die and then finally finish themselves off in the cremation ground, and there seems to be no social religion at all. And yet we know, of course, from early times that there is a Shaiva religion, and this is evidence from, well, the presence of archaeological evidence, lingas. So, yes, these are, I think, extremely early lingas. Well, how early, of course, is difficult to say, but there's an article which by a lady called Gretli von Mitterwallner, which is about the evolution of the linga, and she's devoted a lot of attention to discussing the style of ornamentation on this mysterious figure who is in the temple in Gudimallam in Andhra Pradesh, and the conclusion is that this is BC. This is an extremely early instance of a linga. And in the same article, she shows, I think fairly convincingly, by trying to take only dated instances of lingas, that you can see a clear evolution from naturalistic forms, which very clearly suggest a phallus, and that this gradually we move to more and more geometrical abstractions, typically this form, which is square in section at the base, octagonal in the middle, and then round at the top. And very often with a kind of, with an actual edge. You see a sort of beveling. So this is one in Indonesia. These are ones from pre-Angkorian Cambodia. So those are all sort of 6th century or something. The sheer quantity of these lingas is amazing. I mean, they're all over the world of Indian influence. We find just hundreds and hundreds of these things. And we also find, so here again, this is close by Veerapuram. It's sort of on the way to Kanchipuram. Well, you can see it's very clearly phallic in shape. I think it's very likely that this particular linga is much older than the surroundings, than the pita, the base for it. And you can see that at the back, so this is a feature of Pallava monuments. Pallava period monuments, they place behind the linga an image of Soma Skanda, that's to say Shiva with Uma, I'm afraid she's rather hidden, and then in between them there's a little figure of Skanda. And it seems fairly consistently the case that in Pallava and late Pallava monuments, behind the linga you'll have a Soma Skanda panel. But all of that looks like a later incorporation of what may be a much older linga.
So you mentioned Uma. Who is that exactly?
Uma is one of the many names of Parvati, so the wife of Shiva.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for asking for the benefit of everybody else. It's also good. If you have more questions, please do.
Skanda.
Yes.
In South India, you wouldn't say skanda, and I'm surprised that all the chronology is not so much from South Indian. Like you would, skanda is not. I mean, in Tamil Nadu, it's not used. So I'm just.
Okay, so that's a very interesting question which leads in all directions because. So now we've got into the habit of identifying completely Murugan with Skanda. But if we go back sufficiently in time, is Murugan really the same as Skanda? So I think that Skanda is a very, very complex figure. So as we know, he is now presented as the son of Shiva. And this goes back basically to the period of Kalidasa. That's to say, that's the earliest point in which we can trace this story. Not quite the earliest, but if you look in the Mahabharata, there are, I think, maybe 5 different moments at which a tale is recounted about the birth of birth of Skanda, and each one is different. So each one, I mean, totally different, like involving different parents. So very often he's regarded as the son of Agni. What seems to have happened is that in the period, in or shortly before the period of Kalidasa, so here we're talking about 4th or early 5th century, there is a kind of classical view which emerges, which is that Skanda is the son of Shiva. But what is going on in Sangam literature in Tamil shows that there is a figure called Murugan who is really very different. He seems to be a sort of, he's a spirit who possesses women. And in fact, one of the topoi in classical Sangam poetry is that the lady is lovesick for a particular hero, and she is manifesting all the signs of lovesickness, and her mother or foster mother mistakenly thinks that she is possessed by Murugan, and so she calls the priest of Murugan to exorcise the spirit. And so we have, and so why, you might ask, does this figure Murugan come to be associated with Skanda, the god of war, who is the son of Shiva for Kalidasa and so on? Well, that's a complicated question, but one of the reasons probably is that in the earliest parts of Sanskrit literature where we find references to Skanda, he is a demon. And he is a demon who is associated with possession, and particularly possession to attack the mother who has just given birth to a baby, or the baby, the infant, or the mother when she's about to give birth to the baby. So we find he is definitely associated with possession. But like many deities, so this is the historical viewpoint. Of course, many people have totally different views of this. But I think what has happened is all kinds of different currents of thought have come together to produce one figure whom we now call sometimes Skanda, sometimes Murugan, sometimes Guha, sometimes, and lots of other names, Subramanya. And in fact, if you go back through history and look at all the different disparate sources, you get the impression this is not one figure at all. This is an amalgam of an extremely complex figure. I mean, there are other parts of Skanda I haven't touched upon. Why does he have 6 heads? Well, this is because he's associated with the Pleiades. So he is sometimes said to have been brought up by 6 mothers, and so he developed 6 heads. And the 6 mothers are the visible stars of the constellation, the Pleiades, the Kritika in Sanskrit. Okay, so good question, but that leads us in many directions.
Thank you, that was really
Oh, good.
very interesting because I've been reading up on Morgan. And this gave me some really key important points. Thank you very much.
There's an interesting book about North Indian Murugan, but it doesn't cover the South Indian, called The Rise of Mahasena, which is worth looking at, but it doesn't cover the South Indian data at all, which has not been fitted properly into the picture, I think. Yeah. Sorry, yeah.
I have a question. See, if you and something which is really maybe related, may not be related to the topic, but if you see the spread of Buddhism happened much earlier before Hinduism. Somewhere 3rd century, 1st to 3rd centuries Buddhism and Hinduism. And when I say spread, I'm talking of beyond so-called the Indian borders, the Southeast Asia, right? And it happened in the 8th century, right? Around Cholas, right? Cholagate, am I correct?
Not really, I would say. But I mean, yes, I think a lot of people think this, yes.
So, what led to the decline? Because Buddhism actually was, much more spread out, much more accepted. And while the empires like Champa and, Angkor Wat and all, they went into decline. What can be the possible reason?
I think you're leading me into a completely different topic, and I will not be able to answer that. But I think that, just briefly to say, I don't think that it's quite true that Buddhism reaches before Shaivism and Vaishnavism for a start. I think if we look across Southeast Asia, one of the earliest figures that we see very widespread is what the French call Vishnu Mitre. That's Vishnu wearing a mitre with 4 arms. So this seems to be early evidence of the spread of a merchant network. As for the inscriptional evidence, I think you find Buddhist, Vaishnava and Shaiva. Anyway, I'm not going to go down into why it declined. That's another very complicated issue. So yes, so you might still be saying, well, this looks like a Pallava ensemble. We have Soma Skanda in the back, and we have a Pita, which looks like it could well be 7th or 8th century. But I think that one of the things that you see in Pallava sites pretty much always is a different form of linga. This is very typical. Many Pallava sites, these faceted, highly polished lingas. I don't think that you ever see anywhere else this very realistic phallus type. Yes, and yes, just I was talking about the standard shape of the linga, square, octagonal, round, and then very schematic lines on it that earlier would have been the phallus, and this very sharply beveled edge. This is the sort of classical form of the linga from increasingly from the 7th century onwards. And by the way, this is from a monastery of Pashpatas who call themselves Asitavatra. So it's not as if there is you cannot look at a linga and I think all this digression about the linga is simply because I think many people look at lingas and think a linga is a linga, but absolutely not. It's a very complicated area. There's a lot of evolution. But one of the things that you can say is there doesn't seem to be any particular sectarian quality to a linga. I mean, a linga can belong to different groups. There's no sign on the outside. Okay, another piece of evidence that we get from about Pashpatas is that somewhat belies this presentation. You remember I was saying that in the prescriptive literatures of the Pashpatas, we have the impression that they are exclusively ascetics of a very extreme kind, that they have no social religion. None of that is explained. But there's been a cache of 27 copperplate inscriptions from the 4th century discovered in Madhya Pradesh. And this one is, several of them refer to Pashpatas who are clearly living together in communities. You see at the end of the inscription, it's about this grant of property to be enjoyed by Pashpatas and people living beside the temple. Furthermore, the temple itself seems to have been created by somebody who describes himself as a Pashupata Acharya. So why is this interesting? I think that it shows that the prescriptive literature, again, is ignoring all realia. You remember this distinction I drew between the Roman world, which records ephemeral realia, and the Indian world, which tends to neglect such things and focus. But the exception, of course, is these kinds of legal documents, these copperplate legal documents. The ancestor of the patta, for example, if you have property in India, you know that you need a patta. Well, the ancestor is, patta is this copperplate, basically. So copperplate grants give us this kind of information, and we can see that this particular teacher, who calls himself Pashupata, he actually created a temple, and it seems to have court patronage, and the temple isn't even a temple of Shiva, it's a temple of the Matri, of the mother goddesses. So I think it's clear, in other words, that the prescriptive literature is distorting things, and there's a scholar in Leiden called Peter Bisschop who speculates that, in fact, whatever the literature is telling us, the prescriptive literature, there must have been a much more differentiated community. So there must have been acharyas, who teachers. There must have been the sadhakas, that's to say these ascetics practicing what is taught in the literature, and then some community of lay faithfuls supporting them. And I think that we can probably add to that there must also have been temple priests, and there must have been monasteries. I think that this is visible from the legal documents. Again, an example from further east. This is a 7th century Cambodian inscription. Yes, you can see here the Pallava lettering. If you are able to read South Indian inscriptions of this period, you can see that this is the same. Yes, you can see, sorry, I've given you the whole translation, but you cannot possibly read it all. But there's the structure of the thing on the right. An invocation to Shiva, a sort of Mangala verse, and then a eulogy of the king, a eulogy of the founder. And in this eulogy of the founder, we discover that this is a Pashupata teacher who must be very wealthy because he is making this big endowment, and the endowment has the sanction of the court, and he has studied lots of branches of Sanskrit literature, namely Vaisheshika Nyaya and Vyakarana, grammar. And then at the end of the document, so then we have the details of the foundation, quite a lot of different things he's installed, a temple, Shiva's footprints. So this is something which has apparently disappeared from the Indian world today, but it's very clear that in ancient times it wasn't just Vishnu's feet, Vishnupada, which were worshipped, or Buddhapada, Buddha's feet, but also Shivapada. Kalidasa refers to them at the beginning of his lyrical poem, the Meghaduta. And at the very end here, there's usually a curse and a blessing. Just let me finish. The curse and a blessing, and we see that the endowment is to be enjoyed again by Pashpatas, which implies the existence of a monastery or a community of these Pashpatas, unlike the prescriptive literature, which speaks of isolated individuals seeking spiritual aspiration. Please do.
So I see in the text, I read this lofty mountain of Shiva. Is this the nearby Arunachala, or is it some other mountain, or is it some place that we don't know where it is?
We're in Cambodia here, so it's not Arunachala. But one of the things, if you've ever seen the Cambodian countryside, it's an enormous floodplain with these little tiny pimple-like hills. And in the Sanskrit text, they're always referred to as though they're enormous mountains. Sometimes I read the document and then I see, oh yes, there's a slight incline there. But really, this is common. Mountains always conventionally have to be lofty, touching the moon and so forth. Yes, sorry, just one more inscription from Cambodia. This one I'm just quoting from the middle here, which is the end of the Sanskrit portion. Just because here, in this particular case, it says this monastery, well, I'm supplying that word, has been offered to those beyond the regular walks of life, atyashrami. So we again get this expression, atyashramin, just as we had in the Shvetashvatara Upanishad. And I believe again that it refers to Pashpatas, this extreme group of ascetics who, however extreme they are presented in the literature, turn out in fact also to have been teachers, wealthy persons, patrons, and also grouped together in monasteries. So we have this slightly contrasted picture of Pashpatas from the early period, but in fact I think that there must have been more social religion than we are aware of from the literature that describes them. Yes, we also find evidence in this text here. So this is a 9th century Nepalese manuscript of the Shiva Dharmottara. So this is a text which has been completely neglected by 20th century scholarship, but partly because it seems very boring in the sense that it describes very much lay religion, offering flowers. And it doesn't have any high doctrine, it doesn't have any philosophical discussions. And I suppose that people who study Sanskrit become gradually influenced by this tendency to neglect realia and be interested in the things which the tradition itself typically found most interesting. That's to say, the big questions about the soul and God and the relationship and so forth. So this text has been very much neglected. But one of the interests of it is in the 2nd chapter out of 12, there's a long description of a monastery and how it's really directed at rich patrons and the king, encouraging him to build temples with monasteries. And from all the details that we get there, we can see that these monasteries must have been quite well established. The date of the text may be 7th century. In any case, what it shows is that in a relatively early period, there was a lot of thought about how a monastery should be laid out, and there must have been many monasteries of this period which are now lost. And this I find interesting because the contrast with Buddhism. About Buddhism, we know that there were lots of monasteries, and we have a lot of continuity, but this monasteries in the Shaiva world and Vaishnava world have been less of a focus. The reason for the top image, this is a scene of torture from a hell. In fact, this is the hell called Vaitarani in the gallery of reliefs around the Angkor temple. And the reason why I show it is because there's a label there in the top left. It's impossible to read there, but there are 32 hells in this gallery of heavens and hells in Angkor, and they seem to be the same hells that we find described, the 32 described in the Shiva Dharmottara. In other words, this Shiva Dharmottara text seems once to have been spread across everywhere. I mean, it was very, very widely transmitted and read and thought about.
I have a question. In the Hindu, thank you. In the Hindu religion, after one's passing, there's a holy book called Garuda Purana that is read, and the chapter actually talks about the passage of the soul. And so when we talk about the torture scenes, and so the first few chapters are, what the soul passes through, and then the latter chapters talk about how the soul can really gain salvation is through yoga. And so is there any relevance of the torture scene in these scriptures closer to the Garuda Purana that we talk about?
Yes, thank you. So the Garuda Purana indeed has this famous passage called the Preta Kalpa, which is all about what happens to the soul after death, and it has indeed an account of many of the same hells. The reason why I'm referring, however, to this is, so there are lots of accounts of hells. Usually, so in Manusmriti, for example, there are 28. In some Shaivagamas, there are 80 crore. There are lots of different numbers, but this number 32 is very distinctive of this textual transmission, and that seems to be what we find in the Cambodian representation. The Garudakalpa, the Pretakalpa of the Garuda Purana, I'm not sure what the date is, but in any case, it may well have spread also to this part of the world, but nonetheless, it is not the account of the hells in the Garuda Purana which we find represented in Angkor Wat. So, and indeed, there's one region of India today, as far as I'm aware, namely Malwa, which is sort of at the junction of Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh and Uttar Pradesh, where there really are a lot of still standing old monasteries. And I think that we tend not to pay attention to them. I certainly used not to. So this one stands just to the south of the Mahanaleshwara temple. You can see that it's a massive stone-built thing. I mean, it's not very distinguished in terms of architecture, but it's a fine building. And here's the image that I showed you right at the beginning of the courtyard. You can see that it's a substantial decorated building which has a lot of kind of institutional space which you can use in different ways to sit, to eat, to sleep, for discussions and so forth. And it has an inscription in the balcony at the front, sort of, I think on that pillar there, an inscription in Sanskrit which explains that it is founded by a Parshvata and it is for Parshvatas. So they're a big concrete thing, not concrete, a physical, a big stone building. And we find other religious traditions. So this is part of an enormous 9th century inscription from a place called Ranod. So Ranod, there's the tank in front of this monastery in Ranod. Again, here we're in Madhya Pradesh, not Rajasthan. And again, very fine masonry, absolutely enormously thick slabs making up the roof. And you can see these little castellations here. It seems as though it really may have been intended to be fortified. One of the things that's a bit mysterious about it today is that it refers clearly to the Sanskrit inscription, which is sort of, it's higher than me and down to the floor and all beautifully engraved. It speaks of quite a range of other monasteries in the area, and it speaks of a range of other temples. The temples have all gone. You cannot see anything around it. It's as though this building survived, well, partly because of its solidity, but one can imagine that it might also have served as a sort of barracks, that it had a kind of continuing military purpose or quasi-military purpose. Anyway, the interesting thing is that it's another Shaiva monastery, and as I say, this area, I think there must have been Shaiva monasteries absolutely everywhere. Some of them have survived, or we have later manifestations of them. So I was referring earlier to Tiruvavudurai, south of here near Kumbakonam. And of course we have more modern monasteries. But this area seems in the sort of 9th, 10th centuries to have had a kind of cradle from which Shaivism was disseminated and a great network of temples. And I think there is also independent evidence of that. So these manuscripts I'm showing you, they're different manuscripts of a ritual manual by somebody called Soma Shambhu. So this ritual manual, the Soma Shambhu Padhati, is something which, a lady called Hélène Brunner, she came to Pondicherry and taught maths in the lycée for some years and then became very interested in Shaivism, and then she dedicated quite a number of years of her life to publishing this manual, the Soma Shambhu Padhati. Yes, so I put the details of the publication there. You see she produced the first volume in 1963, next one 68, then 1977, and then 1998. So quite a trajectory. After coming to teach maths in the lycée, she ended up really focusing on this text, which is very complex and difficult to understand. It's a lot of detailed rituals, and so it's 4 fat volumes with a lot of annotation. And this, initially when she came, she believed that this was a South Indian manual, and gradually she came to realize that this was in fact produced by the pontiff of one of these great big stone-built monasteries in the north of India, a place called Gurji. And the reason why I put 2 manuscripts there, one of them is an 11th century manuscript from Nepal, and This is a South Indian one, of course, from here in Grantha script. It seems that we have evidence that this Somashambhu Padati, this text, was immediately after its composition in the 11th century, diffused everywhere. It went into Nepal, it went to Kashmir, it went all the way to South India. There is a South Indian author who was the pontiff of a monastery in Tiruvarur, which no longer exists, this monastery. And he quotes the thing already in the 11th century. In other words, what I'm trying to say is, I think that there was a very big network of monasteries which still survive in this area in North India, and they were networked with the whole subcontinent, and they were produced, and in a way this kind of literature is the kind of literature which you would expect to be produced in a monastic network, because it's a sort of manual of liturgy and complex rituals that standardizes certain practices across the country. In fact, this is not of the Pashupata religion. This is what we call the Shaiva Siddhanta. I don't know whether you've heard this term, Shaiva Siddhanta. So many people today will say, if you go visit a South Indian temple of Shiva today, they will say, we follow the rites and beliefs of the Shaiva Siddhanta. And they give you sometimes the impression that this is a late or post-12th century South Indian, distinctively South Indian religion with its texts in Tamil. But it goes back much earlier. It is in a way the principal current of what we today call Tantrism. So I don't know what ideas you have about Tantrism. We all usually have a lot of strange ideas. One of the names for Tantrism in the early period is Mantra Marga. That's to say, it's the path, Marga, of mantras. And the word Shaiva Siddhanta means the fixed doctrine, that's to say, the dominant view, the well-established dominant view of the Shaiva literature, that's to say, of the literature taught by Shiva. And this religious school... I see I've been going for an hour. This seems incredible. I think I had better stop at some point. Yes, but I think I'm only halfway through. It was impossible to finish. I will try to wrap up a little bit more. What I was going to say about the mantra marga is that it places very great emphasis on mantras, but also on fire. So one of the central rituals is an initiation ritual. You can see this figure here. So he has a cord tied to his top knot, to his shikar. And what happens in this initiation ritual is that his soul is installed on this cord, and the cord has little knots in it, and there is all the worlds of the universe are installed on the cord, and gradually pieces of this cord are cut off and ablated into the fire, and thereby his soul is purified and then reinserted into his body, and then he is guaranteed salvation at the end. Fire is something which is not used by ascetics. So you do not have fire rituals among the Pashpatas. This is an innovation, in a way, of the Mantra Marga, because Tantrism, or the Mantra Marga, at least initially, places this Diksha, this initiation, at the center, says that this is crucial, and it is the prerequisite for pursuing either supernatural powers and pleasures or liberation. And the way you do it is you use these mantras as you ablate into the fire, as you pour oblations into the fire, and the mantras have an efficacy because they are sonic energy which can be used. What is a mantra? Well, you've heard of Vedic mantras, of course. Tantric mantras typically, well, they're either pieces of syntax like this, Om Chandike Krama Krama Swaha, or they may be seed syllable mantras, let's say bijas. So this is an example, and I've given you one from an old manuscript. Here you can see it's written all these different consonants clustered together, almost unpronounceable. This is sort of on the model of Om, if you like, the pranava, the central mantra that contains the whole of the Vedas. So these mantras are used, and just to give you an example, one of the oldest texts that we have surviving is the Nishwasa Tattva Samhita. I think I'm going to skip to this. And it contains a lot of speculation, a lot of meditation practices, a long account of initiation, and then lots and lots and lots and lots of these magical recipes. So here, to bring about sexual good fortune, one should take a flower, a fruit, garment, ornament, garland, unguent, or cord, perform 1,000 oblations into the fire beside it. This is a kind of purification. This is called the Sampata Homa, where you perform oblations into the fire next to an object which you're seeking to empower or purify, and then recite the Aghora mantra 1,000 times over it. This is from a sort of grimoire, lots and lots of recipes using the Aghora mantra. And whoever puts this garland or whatever on, whether oneself or someone else, will have sexual good fortune. Whoever sees them will fall under their spell.
On the previous slide, did it talk about the preparation aspect of it, like where you have to fast for 3 days and you have to
Yes, exactly. But I'm afraid I gave too many examples. I just wanted to sort of show you that this text is somehow something maybe that you wouldn't expect. It has these very spiritual prescriptions about meditation, but it has a lot of what we would think of as rather worldly magic, defeating enemies and so forth. And so why is this? How is this possible? This was just to show you this rather beautiful 9th century manuscript from Nepal, again, of the same text. But it has also speculations about how we can acquire all the powers of language by assuming the form of each letter of the alphabet with our bodies. So sort of something like postural yoga with a kind of partly spiritual, partly magical purpose. And then it has lots of these graded meditation exercises. I'm going to go through those very fast. You may be familiar with some of them. I mean, this notion that we associate, that we do meditation in different parts of the body focuses on the different elements using a certain seed syllable, and this is something which finds its origin in these early mantra marga texts like the Nishwasa. So earth, water, and then moving up the body, fire, and then wind and ether. And this is something which we find, you see lots of yogic pictures with these same square for earth at the bottom, and then semicircular lunar for the water and so forth. I mean, there are many, many examples, and if you've ever been to Japanese cemeteries, you see the same idea, that somehow the elements of the body represented there, square, round, and so forth. So it's extremely widespread. So it seems lots and lots of illustrations of this. I think I move on. So why is it possible to have this kind of notion that a text where these ideas of worldly power and spiritual aims are somehow so imbricated? Well, I think it's because even liberation is somehow seen as a sort of siddhi, that's to say, a special supernatural power, and it's conceived of as each soul has within them infinite power to know and to act, and this is somehow revealed by the mantras. And and ultimate siddhi, the ultimate supernatural power, is to attain that state, to realize that state again. But so, of course, incidentally, it can also give you all kinds of other powers along the way. I think at this point I'm simply going to stop because I'm never going to get to the rest of what I was going to say. So thank you very much for your patience and tolerance, and please do ask further questions. I'm sorry that I could not reach the end of my program. Perhaps I could just look at my conclusion and see whether there's something worth. I did carefully write it all out just in case I would lose my pass, and I have lost my pass. Yes, the conclusion doesn't bear very much relation, sorry. It was about, well, as you'd expect, the forces of organized religion are, I think, in constant tension with spiritual aspirations. And I was going to say something about how we might have the feeling that these spiritual aspirations are somehow so constrained by organized religion, or that we might think of them as even stifled, but that we have to remember that probably we wouldn't have transmitted to us from earlier days all of these ideas, all of these spiritual meditative exercises and so forth. These wouldn't have come down to us had we not had the monasteries, which gave us, which gave a kind of institutional framework, and then a possibility of continuity, a forum for teaching, concentration of wealth and so forth. So it's one of those things you cannot really imagine many of the features of the religion, of the spiritual side of the religion, without having also the institutional factors. That was going to be my conclusion. But there's a lot that I missed out along the way. Sorry about that. I see lots of hands. I don't know who would like to. So I think you would maybe be the first to raise a hand.
Yes, thank you. So I attended a lecture by Jason Schwartz at Stanford, and in fact, he mentioned you and he was very appreciative of the help that he had working with you on texts. But one of the arguments he was making is that, if I understood correctly, is that the phallic symbol seems to be very widespread in the early BCE period, and at some point it starts to be associated with Shaivism. And even, I think he says also that the Pashupata sect, the association with Shaivism happens at a later stage. I'm wondering if you want to speak to that that transition.
Well, that's an interesting question. I don't know the answer to it, but it is rather striking that this Gudimalam Lingam, which is often presented as one of the clear cases where something really ancient, you look at the iconography of the figure, and if you didn't know that this was adossed onto a phallus, would you know that this was in any way connected to Shiva? And it's an interesting question. I mean, he looks like he's a hunter. He seems to be holding some sort of prey here. He seems to be subduing some kind of demon, or standing on the shoulders in any case of this demon. But he doesn't really have anything that says Shiva. And so I think some people feel, well, yes, it's possible after all that we have some other kind of cult of the phallus, which has only become associated with Shaivism. But one has to be a little bit careful. I mean, there are references not in the Pashupata Sutras themselves, but in the earliest commentary to the worship of the Linga. And indeed in this, early Nishwasa Tantra, there's a presentation of the Pashupata religion which mentions as central the worship of the Linga. So I don't know. Yes, sorry.
So in Shaivism, you have shown the different variation of the Linga. So now around the Linga, if you go at the same terminology, there's yoni. So is that also talked about in Shaivism, and is there a link between that and something talked about?
That's of course it's talked about. So there are many early accounts of how one should do a pratishtha. That's to say, how do you install a linga? And one of the things that's a bit mysterious to me about those accounts is that it's not clear whether there is one particular moment which constitutes the central moment of this installation. So in recent days we've all been hearing a lot about prana pratishtha, the prana pratishtha of Rama. Prana pratishtha appears, but only in very late manuals, I mean in the second millennium. There's no moment when prana pratishtha in any of these early accounts is important. But there are all kinds of other possible moments which seem like they might be really significant moments. So one of them is the moment when you draw these lines with a golden stylus, the Pashvarikas.
Sorry, not this one, around later.
Yeah, no, I'm getting to it. Sorry, I'm just explaining that there are all these different moments which people consider crucial for, or could consider crucial for being the moment when the god is given power. And just to finish with the Pashvarika, immediately after that, it's paralleled in if you have an image which is anthropomorphic. The opening of the eyes, the netron milana, seems to be very central, and it comes at the same moment when you have the drawing of the Pashvarika. So, and then immediately after that, various mangala offerings are shown to the deity, who is then therefore somehow now inside the icon. But one of the other moments is the moment when the yoni or pita is lowered over the... So this is something you cannot see with this kind of linga because it's not there. But Madame Bernaire has written a long article which is called something like On the Sexual Meaning of the Linga. And she explains that the central moment of installation is the moment when this collar of stone is lowered over the linga, which usually has this classical shape. So that this is what you only see in archaeological sites and museums, where you see all levels of the linga. But normally there is indeed this pita around it, and the pita has often a square base that can be round, and then above that there's this collar of stone, and it's clear that in a lot of these mantra maga passages describing installation, the moment of lowering the collar of stone over the linga is inside what's called the garbhagriha, is seen as having a kind of sexual significance and as being the moment, the crucial moment of installation. In other words, there clearly is some reflection about this, first of all, the sexual nature of the thing, of the icon, but secondly also the identification of the base with the Oni. So this is something that is recognized in some literature. But usually when you venerate a linga, at least according to the later theoreticians, you are supposed to completely suppress the exterior form in your mind and project into it an image of the deity Sadashiva. So that I think there is also plentiful evidence that suggests that there is a tussle with this sexual imagery. And now, if you look on the Wikipedia page of Linga, you can see that it is a constant battle between the people on the one hand who wish to say, this is a phallus, and the people on the other hand who say, this is never a phallus. So it's a kind of complicated issue, and I think you see evidence of that all through history. Sorry, I think Martin was one of the other people who was going to ask.
Dominic, in the Vedic literature we have Rudra, and then Shiva is in the Rig Veda just an adjective. There's no Devata, and I was just wondering how far back you've managed to go to bridge, because there's some debate about Rudra and Shiva. I mean, there are similarities but also differences. So how do you bridge the two?
I do not bridge. I mean, it seems to me when we go back sufficiently far, we're already lost. We do not have enough evidence really to do more than speculate. What seems to be clear is that there is a Rudra figure, that this is identified with Shiva, and Shiva is some sort of apotropaic name used. We call him, initially in any case, we call him beneficent or auspicious, partly because we do not wish to use the name which is terrifying, just as Sanskrit words for bee, for example. We have all these sort of apotropaic words like shatpada, the thing with 6 legs, rather than naming it. Yes, sorry, you haven't asked a question, so please.
You showed a Nepali manuscript and a manuscript from Tamil Nadu from the 19th century. You mentioned it was Grantha. Is it Sanskrit or Tamil?
It's Sanskrit.
It's Sanskrit. And what would be, you mentioned that those texts, they kind of talk about the liturgy or about the rituals, about what are the connections we have between Pashupata or Saiva monastery in Nepal and in Tamil Nadu? Are there some connections? Do we know some sort of exchanges between them?
Well, this particular text, and these are different manuscripts of the same text, and it actually is clearly written in Madhya Pradesh, and clearly seems to have been deliberately disseminated in the lifetime of the pontiff of that monastery in Madhya Pradesh.
So, written at about what time?
The beginning of the 11th century. So interestingly, we have numerous different dates of composition given, and I think that this reflects the fact that he was editing it, let's say publishing it, giving it to different Shaiva colleagues. And so one of the earliest dates we have is in fact from a totally different manual produced in Tiruvarur, where he is quoting lines from this and saying this, I'm quoting from this text, but he is quoting it at a point which is earlier than all the other dates of edition that we have mentioned in earlier manuscripts, which to me suggests the idea that it's really a sort of publication, but in slightly different revised editions, which was spreading during the lifetime of this figure across the Shaiva network. In other words, it was very well organized, very well funded, and there were a lot of people traveling. I think some other Shaiva texts we can see from the colophons, from some of these early Nepalese ones, we sometimes have the information that they are who copied them in Nepal, so how they arrived. And in one case, a manuscript of the Brihat Kalotra, we have the information that it was copied at the behest of of a particular Nepalese king who is dated in Benares. And one can imagine that Benares again was a kind of focus for the copying of manuscripts. And I think this has long been said, that certain religious centres were places where people came together from all directions and then copied each other's texts. But I think what has not perhaps been realised, or not, is certainly not commented upon, but it's sort of obvious as well, is that some monasteries must also have been poles, they must have been focuses. And I think that this is something which everybody sort of takes for granted when they look at Benedictine monasteries or whatever in Europe. But for some reason, people have not really been writing about that in the case of Hindu literature. And I think it's partly because this Hindu literature doesn't emphasize this aspect of things. Yes, please.
I wonder about the oral transmission, because we focus a lot on the writings, and what you could say about it?
Oral transmission is sort of a fixation among Indologists. People always emphasize how extraordinary and unique the oral transmission of Vedic scripture is. And indeed, it is absolutely extraordinary. When one goes to places in Thrissur in Kerala, for example, you can see these students in the Pathshala, their heads manipulated so that to echo the accents, so that they really learn the thing. And then, of course, you don't just learn the Padapata, that's say the words in their order, but you have all these complex rearrangements, so that which are sort of the opposite of mnemonic patterns. They don't aid at all, but they anchor the text so firmly that you cannot make a mistake with a syllable. And this is absolutely an extraordinary thing. But I think that the vast majority of Indian literature was not transmitted orally. It simply wasn't. And I think that even certain parts of the Vedic literature were not. So there's a German scholar called Wilhelm Rau, now deceased, who tried to show that Shankara's commentary on certain Upanishads, which of course the latest part of the Vedic corpus, were clearly not transmitted to him orally, and that he had the kinds of mistakes in his text that he was commenting on, which depended on a written transmission.
And just because the Upanishad and all is about hearing, receiving through sound, and Shaktipat is really the transmission without scripture.
And it's also, indeed, I think the Indian tradition itself emphasizes the importance of oral transmission. You cannot, so for example, you find many prescriptions to the effect, you cannot read this mantra from a text and then use it. It has to come to you from teaching. And I think that that's indeed true. But nonetheless, I think textual transmission, that's to say transmission of large corpora of text, you can see that this has been going on in written form for many, many centuries. And even the mantra parts of the Vedic corpus, it turns out that we have, although one is supposed not to write them down, we have quite early manuscripts. One of the more famous ones is an early Atharva Veda manuscript from Kashmir in Sharada script. So I think that yes, oral transmission is very important and has always been regarded as very important, and there are certain kinds of literature which have been primarily transmitted orally, but most Indian literature has primarily been transmitted by writing.
Tantrism, right, has got references in Jainism and Buddhism. They were quite kind of well accepted. And we just saw what they're in Shaivism. So if they were like parallel, or they were crossing the path, I mean, to say in terms of the thought process.
It seems as though Shaivism was a vector of influence, and that Jaina Tantras have been produced partly under the influence of Shaiva Tantras. So there's a thing called, for example, the Nirvana Kalika, which in fact rewrites parts of this treatise. That's to say, you can see that the lines of this work of Somashambhu have been sort of reworked, replacing words here and there. And similarly, there's a fragment of a Buddhist manual, Buddhist tantric manual, again, which is based upon this particular work of Somashambhu. But this is a very contested topic.
I have one question. Is in this? Yeah, maybe we can continue the discussion later outside. I have one question. Is this effort of conservation and what it means today, and how do you find these? How do you conserve these? And I understand it's the work of the School of Extreme Orient. Can we come consult the books? How does it work? If,
Yes, so it goes without saying we have a library. We're a publicly funded French institution. You are welcome to come and visit. You're welcome to come and see the manuscripts that we have. We have a small collection of about 1,600 manuscripts, which together with the larger collection of the French Institute, 8,600 manuscripts, jointly they were recognized by UNESCO in 2005 as a memory of the world collection. This is because the Shiva manuscripts in Pondicherry constitute a very large collection of Shiva literature. We also try, so this particular manuscript here is from the Shiva monastery of Tiruvavurdurai, but we also try to photograph manuscripts in other collections, like this manuscript here, and then keep them together so that, because as you know, whereas in Nepal, in Kathmandu we have a dry, cold climate, things survive many centuries. Here, the earliest manuscripts that you tend to find, when they're dated, they tend to be, the earliest ones tend to be dated in the last decades of the 18th century. Things in this climate do not last that long. One has to keep copying and copying and copying, and as you know, nobody is copying manuscripts today, except photographically. So, but please do come and visit. The library is there, and as I say, our manuscripts are also visible. We have digitized them all, and we're trying to get them online. Of course, whether this is really a strategy for perennisation is a difficult question. Maybe the internet will implode, maybe there will be digital data creep, whatever. But it does mean that, so one of the paradoxes of this age is that we have unparalleled access through travel and photographic reprography. We have unparalleled access to enormous numbers of texts which our ancestors could never have all seen together. And yet there is a concomitant loss of interest generally. Everybody is doing other things, so we can see all of these things, but will we? I don't know.
Are there conferences or things we can follow from the...
Yes, I mean we have workshops. So reading this kind of material, as you can imagine, requires effort and time, but we do have sessions where people come from outside and we all sit together on the same documents and try and read them, particularly these days epigraphy, so we're trying to read inscriptions a great deal, and the inscriptions take a lot of energy also to decode. I mean, when sometimes colleagues from Cambodia send me photographs of inscription, it seems to take roughly 10 years from that moment to the moment when I actually get to publish something, because somehow one goes on thinking about it, and then there are some letters which are not quite clear, and then suddenly there's a breakthrough or not. And then one sees them, how they fit in with other contexts. And it's a very time-consuming process, understanding these documents. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.